June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy were silent for a moment. The kind of silence that made every soldier's breath sound like thunder. The air smelled of diesel, hot metal, and damp earth. American tank crews from the 3rd Armored Division had just fought their way through a French village half-turned to rubble. Then, through the smoke, they saw it. Something massive, something unlike any German tank they had ever seen before. It sat there, half hidden by the wreckage of a barn, its long 88mm gun pointing uselessly into the ground. The great iron beast, a German Tiger I, was dead in the field. At first, the men thought it was a trap. No way those bastards just left this thing sitting here, one of the Sherman gunners muttered. The Tiger's reputation had already reached mythic proportions across the front. Stories of Shermans being torn apart from a mile away, of shells bouncing off its armor like pebbles, had spread through every platoon. A corporal named Frank DeLuca, 22 years old and covered in soot, was the first to approach. He circled the Tiger cautiously, carbine raised, expecting a German to burst out of the hatch with a grenade. But the only thing that moved was a wisp of smoke rising from the engine deck. The German crew had abandoned it, most likely out of fuel. The tank's tracks were half buried in churned mud. On its flank, scorch marks showed where an American shell had struck and glanced off. The crew had fired until the last round, then fled. For the American tankers, it felt like finding a dragon's carcass. Captain John Red Holloway radioed back to headquarters. "Command, we've got a Tiger. Repeat, an intact Tiger. Crew's gone. Requesting recovery team." His voice was steady, but every man nearby could hear the disbelief behind it. As engineers and mechanics arrived, they surrounded the tank like archaeologists discovering an ancient relic. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The armor was nearly 5 inches thick at the front, the gun barrel longer than a truck, and the interior, when they finally pried it open, was a maze of levers, gears, and bullet casings. Inside, the smell was overpowering. Oil, cordite, and something burnt. Maps and ration tins were scattered on the floor. A blood-stained headset hung from a periscope. Whoever had crewed this machine had left in a hurry. By dusk, the Tiger was hauled onto a transport for examination. As it was towed away, the American soldiers followed it with their eyes silent. The machine was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a masterpiece of engineering, and yet, somehow, a symbol of German desperation. Back at the field depot, the recovery team began inspecting the beast. Sergeant DeLuca ran his hand along the thick armor plate. "No wonder we couldn't dent it," he murmured. The mechanics shook their heads, marveling at the precision of the welds, the massive transmission, the sheer scale of the engine compartment. But as they studied it, something became clear. The Tiger was not invincible. It was fragile in its own way. Its gearbox was overly complex, its tracks already worn from just a few dozen miles of operation, and its fuel tanks nearly bone dry. That night, as rain began to fall on the French countryside, the Americans realized they hadn't just captured a tank. They'd captured a glimpse into the German war machine itself. The Tiger wasn't just a weapon. It was a statement of power, pride, and fear. Captain Holloway wrote in his field journal, "They built a monster, beautiful, terrifying, but doomed by its own weight. If they have to run this thing every day, they'll run out of gas before they run out of courage." In the coming weeks, this single captured Tiger would be shipped back for testing, its secrets dissected by Allied engineers. But on that June evening, as the men sat around their Shermans and watched the colossal machine rusting in the rain, they couldn't help but feel a strange respect. The Tiger had fallen, not in a blaze of glory, but in silence, out of fuel, left behind by men who once believed it was unstoppable. And for the first time, American tankers began to understand that even the mightiest of enemies had limits. When the Tiger I finally arrived at the American Field Depot, it drew a small crowd. Mechanics, engineers, and tank crews gathered around it, as if they were witnessing something otherworldly. The sheer presence of the machine was enough to silence even the loudest of men. Under the pale morning light, its thick armor plates glistened with dew. Every surface seemed overbuilt, deliberate, and cold. The Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a statement, a symbol of German engineering pride and battlefield dominance. Sergeant Frank DeLuca, the same man who'd first approached the abandoned Tiger, stared at it in disbelief. "Look at the size of that thing," he muttered. "You could park 2 Shermans under it." The men laughed, but their humor was uneasy. They had seen what this monster could do on the field. Nearby, Captain Holloway climbed onto the tank's hull. From up close, the armor felt impenetrable, thick as the walls of a fortress. He knocked on it with his fist, solid steel, nearly 5 inches thick at the front. "You hit this with a 75, he said, "and it just laughs at you." An American mechanic named Ellis whistled softly. "No wonder our shells bounce off." When they finally opened the turret hatch, a waft of burned oil and metal greeted them. The interior was cramped, yet astonishingly complex. Levers, dials, ammunition racks, and thick steel braces filled every inch. Everything had a purpose. Everything was crafted with surgical precision. One of the engineers traced a finger along the sighting system. "Optics from Zeiss," he said quietly. "This is top-of-the-line stuff. You could thread a needle with this scope." The Americans began to understand why the Tiger had inspired such fear. The long 88mm gun, the KWK-36, was not just a weapon, it was an executioner. On the battlefield, it could knock out a Sherman from more than a mile away before the Americans could even see it. "Imagine sitting in a tin can like ours," DeLuca said. "And this thing fires at you. You'd never even know what hit you." Yet the more they looked, the more contradictions they saw. The craftsmanship was immaculate, but everything about it seemed excessive. The transmission was massive and delicate at the same time, filled with hundreds of moving parts. The suspension system was ingenious, yet so complicated that repairing it in the field would be nearly impossible. An older engineer, Lieutenant Rawlins, shook his head. "This isn't a battlefield tank," he said quietly. "It's a museum piece. A masterpiece, sure, but not practical for war." They inspected the ammunition storage next. Huge brass shells nearly as tall as a man's arm, weighing over 40 pounds each. Loading them required strength and precision, and even a single mistake could jam the gun. The American crews exchanged looks. Their Shermans were crude by comparison, but simple and reliable. Outside, a group of infantrymen gathered, staring at the Tiger as if it were a captured alien craft. "That's what's been tearing through our lines," one said softly. Another added, "Hard to believe they built enough of these to matter." But they hadn't. Even then, intelligence officers knew that the Germans had built only a few hundred Tigers. Each one required enormous resources, steel, labor, fuel, that Germany was rapidly running out of. The Allies, by contrast, were producing thousands of Shermans every month. Still, none of that diminished the impact of seeing one up close. The Tiger represented something psychological. It wasn't just metal and bolts, it was fear forged into form. Later that afternoon, an American war correspondent arrived to photograph the captured tank. His camera clicked steadily as men posed beside it, dwarfed by its bulk. One soldier climbed onto the barrel and stretched out along its length like a child on a playground slide. "You could use this thing as a bridge," he joked. But beneath the laughter, a quiet respect lingered. They all knew what this machine could do if it were still alive. As evening fell, the Tiger loomed in the fading light like a sleeping giant. Shadows crawled over its armor, making it look almost alive again. Some men swore they could still smell the gunpowder in its barrel, still hear the echo of battle. Captain Holloway stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the beast. "You know," he said to DeLuca, "if they could build 1,000 of these, we'd be in real trouble." DeLuca nodded. "Good thing they can't," he replied. For a moment they were silent. The sound of distant artillery rumbled through the hills, a reminder that the war was far from over. But standing before the Tiger, they realized something important. This machine, for all its power, carried the seeds of its own defeat. It was too big, too heavy, too complicated for the brutal simplicity of modern war. And as the sun set over Normandy, the American tankers walked away from the captured Tiger, leaving it standing in the mud, an iron monument to both German brilliance and German hubris. A monster, yes, but one that could never truly conquer the battlefield. When the captured Tiger I was finally hauled into the Allied test yard, the mechanics treated it like a patient on an operating table. Every tool clanged with purpose. Every panel removed revealed another layer of mystery. For the first time, American engineers could finally look inside the most feared tank of the war, and what they found left them both impressed and bewildered. The Tiger's upper hull came off piece by piece, bolts cracking loose after years of German precision. Beneath it, a labyrinth of machinery emerged: fuel lines, coolant pumps, pressure valves, and wiring that looked more like something out of an aircraft than a ground vehicle. Captain Holloway stood beside the tank with his notebook open. "It's a damn clockwork nightmare," he muttered. "Beautiful, but overcomplicated." The chief mechanic, Sergeant Rawlins, crawled halfway inside the open engine bay. "This transmission alone has more moving parts than a Sherman's entire powertrain," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "You'd need an entire workshop just to fix one jam." They weren't exaggerating. The Tiger's gearbox, the Maybach-Olver system, was an engineering marvel on paper. It allowed fine control over speed and direction, something no other tank could match. But it was delicate, and it required skilled maintenance crews and spare parts that the front lines rarely had. The Americans were fascinated. They measured the armor thickness, over 100 millimeters at the front, sloped only slightly but nearly impenetrable. They documented the intricate overlapping road wheels, designed to distribute the Tiger's massive weight but notorious for clogging with mud and freezing solid in winter. Every discovery told a story, German engineering brilliance clashing with the realities of war. An engineer named Mason ran his hand over the precision machine's steel surfaces. "They built this like a luxury car," he said softly. "No wonder it costs them a fortune." It was true. Each Tiger took nearly 300,000 man-hours to build. Its components were hand-fitted, its tolerances exact to the millimeter. In a factory where Allied tanks rolled off assembly lines in dozens per day, Germany was crafting Tigers one at a time, like custom jewelry for destruction. Inside the turret, the Americans studied the gunner's position. The optics from the Carl Zeiss Company were crystal clear even after months in the field. Through that lens, a gunner could hit a moving target more than a mile away. The fire control system, while manual, was astonishingly precise. But the interior also revealed the Tiger's flaws. Space was suffocating. The commander's seat was wedged between ammunition racks, with only a few inches to move. The gun breech dominated the compartment, its recoil mechanism eating half the turret space. When the 88mm cannon fired, the entire vehicle shook violently. The crew had to brace themselves every time. "Looks impressive," one American said, "but I wouldn't want to fight inside it." Rawlins nodded. "This isn't a soldier's tank," he replied. It's an engineer's dream and a mechanic's nightmare. As they traced the electrical systems, they found that even the smallest repair would require tearing apart half the vehicle. The cooling system ran on twin radiators connected by a maze of pipes. The steering was hydraulic, powerful but fragile. And the sheer weight, nearly 60 tons, meant the Tiger chewed through transmissions, road wheels, and fuel at an astonishing rate. They recorded every detail for intelligence reports. Notes, photographs, sketches, all of it would be sent back to Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States, where further testing would expose just how impractical this supertank really was. But none of that diminished the awe the Americans felt. Despite its flaws, the Tiger was undeniably magnificent, an embodiment of German precision and obsession. As Holloway wrote in his journal, "You can feel the pride in every weld. Every bolt tells you these men believed they were building perfection. But perfection has no place in war." Later that afternoon, as the mechanics reassembled the Tiger for a mobility test, they realized something extraordinary. Even after months of combat and neglect, when the engine roared to life, it sounded like thunder. The ground trembled beneath their boots. Every man turned to look. The Maybach HL-230 engine spat smoke, coughed, then settled into a deep, steady growl. It was alive again, the beast breathing once more. For a brief moment, everyone stood silent, staring at it with a mix of respect and fear. The Tiger wasn't just a machine. It was a philosophy made of steel power without compromise, beauty without practicality. And as the mechanics watched the massive tank lurch forward, gears grinding and exhaust belching, one of them whispered, "Now I get why they call it the Tiger. Because up close, it didn't just look dangerous. Felt dangerous. But deep down, every man there knew, no matter how powerful it seemed, this level of engineering genius came with a price. One the Germans were already paying. A masterpiece of design, yes, but also a monument to overkill. The morning air was cool and heavy with the scent of oil and exhaust as the mechanics prepared the captured Tiger I for its first full test. Weeks of inspection had led to this moment. The Americans had analyzed every inch of its armor, measured every component, and argued endlessly over its engineering. Now, they wanted to know one simple thing: how far could this beast actually go? At the proving grounds outside St. Lo, the Tiger stood waiting like a caged animal. Its yellow-gray armor gleamed under the weak French sun. Mechanics swarmed around it, checking fuel lines, tightening bolts, and making sure the Maybach HL-230 engine would run without tearing itself apart. Sergeant Rawlins climbed onto the rear deck, clipboard in hand. "We're topping her off," he called out. "Full tank, 540 liters. Let's see what the Krauts built here." The numbers alone made the men whistle. 540 liters, over 140 gallons of precious gasoline. Enough to fuel 2 whole platoons of jeeps for a day. All of it poured into one machine. As the fuel gurgled down into the tank, Captain Holloway leaned over to DeLuca and muttered, "That's a whole convoy's worth of gas. Let's hope she can at least make it across Normandy." When the engine finally turned over, the sound was deafening. The Maybach roared to life with a deep metallic growl that echoed across the valley. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stacks, curling into the sky like a signal flare. The mechanics stepped back, covering their faces from the fumes. "All right," Rawlins shouted over the noise. "Let's take her for a run." The Tiger lurched forward, its massive tracks grinding through the mud. Every turn of its wheels tore deep gouges into the earth. It was terrifyingly powerful but also awkward, like watching a heavyweight boxer try to dance. First, everything seemed fine. The tank rolled over small hills, crushed through shallow ditches, and thundered across open ground. The American observers watched from a distance, scribbling notes and snapping photographs. But after just 20 miles, the fuel gauge began to dip faster than anyone expected. "Check that again," Holloway said, frowning. "We just filled it." The mechanics checked, rechecked, then shook their heads. The Tiger was guzzling fuel at an unbelievable rate, nearly 5 gallons every mile. By the time the odometer read 120 miles, the massive engine sputtered and died. Empty, completely dry. Rawlins climbed out, slamming the hatch behind him. "That's it," he said flatly. 120 miles. On a full tank. The crew stared in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding," one of the mechanics muttered. "That's all. That's all," Rawlins replied. "Half a day's drive and she's bone dry." Captain Holloway wrote down the numbers in silence. He didn't need to say it. Everyone already understood what it meant. The Tiger, for all its fearsome power, was a logistical nightmare. The realization hit them hard. Every Tiger on the battlefield wasn't just a weapon. It was a burden. To keep one running required a constant stream of fuel trucks, mechanics, and spare parts. In Germany's crumbling war economy, that kind of support was impossible to maintain. As Holloway later wrote in his report, "It's not the enemy that will stop this tank. It's its own hunger." The Americans began running the calculations. In combat, with rough terrain, the range would be even worse, maybe 60-70 miles at best. That meant a Tiger unit could only fight a few hours before it had to retreat or refuel. In comparison, their Shermans could travel nearly 3 times the distance on the same amount of fuel, and there were thousands of them. The Tiger might dominate a duel, but the war wasn't fought in duels. It was fought with supply lines, convoys, and numbers. Later that afternoon, they drained the engine oil to inspect the wear. Even after a short run, the components showed heavy strain. The transmission was overheating, the suspension groaning from the tank's sheer weight. It was clear the Tiger wasn't built for endurance. It was built for intimidation. As the test concluded, the tank sat motionless in the field, its engine clicking softly as it cooled. The Americans stood around it, no longer awed, now analytical, almost pitying. DeLuca broke the silence. "All that armor, all that power," he said quietly. "And it can't even drive from Paris to the coast." Holloway nodded. "It's a lion in a cage," he replied. "Strong as hell, but it can't survive outside." That evening, as the men packed up their tools, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the Tiger's battered hull. What had once been the symbol of German invincibility now looked like a relic, massive, proud, and hopelessly inefficient. They'd expected to uncover a monster of war. Instead, they found a machine too greedy to survive its own greatness. And as the Americans left the proving ground, one truth echoed among them. The Tiger wasn't defeated by the enemy. It was defeated by the laws of practicality, and by the simple fact that no army can outrun its own fuel gauge. When the Americans first met the Tiger I in battle, it was as if they'd stumbled upon a creature from another world. Its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman tank from over a mile away. Its armor was nearly impenetrable from the front, and its massive tracks crushed everything beneath them: mud, fences, even smaller vehicles. To the men in olive drab, the Tiger seemed invincible. But behind the legend, the truth was far more complicated. In the chaos of Normandy, tank duels were rarely fair or cinematic. The Tiger, though fearsome, was slow to turn, heavy to move, and extremely few in number. Fewer than 1,400 were ever built. By comparison, the Americans produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. The Tiger was a masterpiece of German engineering, but also a monument to inefficiency. It could dominate a small battlefield, but it could never dominate a war. On the testing grounds, American engineers compared the two machines side by side. The Tiger's armor was thick, but its edges were flat, giving shells a better chance to bite in. The Sherman's armor was thinner but sloped, deflecting hits more effectively than expected. And while the Tiger could punch through anything it faced, its slow turret rotation and limited visibility often meant it was too late to react. In real combat, survival wasn't always about who shot harder. It was about who spotted first, moved faster, and had support. And the Sherman excelled in that unseen war of logistics. A Sherman crew could refuel, rearm, and get back into the fight within hours. Spare parts were everywhere. A damaged Tiger, however, might sit immobilized for days, waiting for a part that no longer existed. Sergeant Rawlins, one of the American tankers who had inspected the captured Tiger, summed it up perfectly in his field notes. You could win a duel with one of these things, but you'd lose a war trying to build them. On the front lines, American tankers learned to fight smarter. Instead of confronting Tigers head-on, they used tactics, flanking, smoke screens, and coordinated artillery. Air support became their equalizer. A P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with rockets, could turn even the most feared German tank into a burning wreck in seconds. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, these differences were on full display. German Tigers led the offensive with terrifying force, smashing through villages and snow-covered forests. But as their fuel ran low and their supply lines collapsed, the Tigers began to slow. Shermans, by the hundreds, filled the gaps, surrounding and isolating the German armor. One American commander later recalled, "They could kill 10 of ours, but we could send 20 more." In the end, numbers always won. That cold arithmetic defined modern warfare. The Tiger represented perfection at any cost. The Sherman represented practicality at scale. And history had already chosen its victor. In Allied depots, engineers continued to study the Tiger's remains. They admired its craftsmanship, the precision gears, the thick armor plates, the finely tuned optics. But they also saw the flaws. Over-engineering that wasted precious resources, weight that strained bridges, and engines that guzzled fuel faster than any army could provide. The Sherman, by contrast, was the tank of the industrial age, simple, adaptable, and endlessly replaceable. Its gun could be upgraded, its armor reinforced, and its design modified for dozens of battlefield roles. In one report from 1945, a U.S. ordnance officer wrote, "The Tiger was designed by engineers. The Sherman was designed by soldiers." By the time Berlin fell, the myth of the Tiger had faded into legend. Its roar had terrified entire divisions, but its impact on the outcome of the war was minimal. For every Tiger that rumbled onto the field, there were 50 Shermans waiting, supported by air power, fuel, and manpower the Germans could no longer match. Still, the Tiger's psychological effect was undeniable. Even the rumor of one nearby could stall an advance, forcing Allied tankers to act cautiously. It was a weapon that fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. In the end, though, the Allies proved that wars aren't won by fear, they're won by production, logistics, and persistence. When Captain Holloway looked at the captured Tiger one last time, he admired it not as an enemy, but as a monument to a vanished era. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, "but beauty doesn't win wars." The Tiger was strength without sustainability. The Sherman was compromise turned into victory. And that, more than any battle, told the story of World War II. The triumph of practicality over perfection, and of countless ordinary machines defeating one extraordinary monster. By late 1944, the Third Reich's most powerful weapon wasn't its tanks or guns. It was fuel, or rather, the lack of it. Every Tiger that rolled off the assembly line carried a silent curse, an endless thirst for gasoline that Germany could no longer quench. In theory, the WWII was the pinnacle of armored warfare. In practice, it was a stranded beast, chained to a crumbling supply network. Each tank needed more than 500 liters of fuel just to travel 100 miles. Multiply that by a battalion, and the numbers became absurd. Tens of thousands of liters every week, at a time when Germany's oil fields were being bombed into dust. Across Europe, German commanders faced a bitter truth. Their mighty panzers couldn't move without fuel, and fuel was vanishing faster than men. In early 1944, Allied bombers had turned their focus toward the synthetic fuel plants, the refineries at Politz, Luna, and Blechhammer. Within months, the Luftwaffe's protection had collapsed, and Germany's fuel production dropped by over 70%. By autumn, the Wehrmacht was rationing gasoline like gold. At the front, Tiger crews were ordered to conserve every drop. Some tanks were hidden in forests for days, waiting for fuel convoys that never arrived. Others were towed by smaller vehicles, just to be positioned for ambush. The once proud armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht were reduced to stationary bunkers of steel. One German officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We have the best tanks in the world, but they sit useless in the mud, waiting for ghosts of fuel trucks that will never come." Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Their Shermans and Cromwells, though less powerful, had something far more important: logistics. The Allies had built entire floating harbors at Normandy, pipelines across the Channel, and fuel depots that could feed entire armies. Where the Tiger consumed, the Sherman supplied. Back in the American test grounds, Captain Holloway and his team studied the captured Tiger's fuel consumption data. The results were staggering. "It's not a tank," Holloway said, shaking his head. "It's a refinery on tracks." Sergeant Rawlins pointed at the figures. "If the Germans ran 100 of these things, they'd drain an entire division's fuel reserve in a week." And that's exactly what was happening. German armored divisions were constantly short on gasoline. Units were forced to abandon tanks, not because of enemy fire, but because their engines ran dry. In some cases, retreating crews destroyed their own Tigers to keep them from falling into Allied hands. The Americans realized that Germany's obsession with technical perfection had created a monster it could no longer feed. Each Tiger required an enormous logistical train: fuel trucks, repair teams, and spare parts that had to travel hundreds of miles through Allied air superiority. By 1944, most of those convoys never made it. Allied fighter bombers hunted them mercilessly. Without fuel, the Tigers became useless statues of steel, abandoned by the roadside. At night, Allied reconnaissance pilots reported seeing strange glints along the highways. Rows of Tigers, their hulls reflecting moonlight, immobile and silent. The Germans tried to adapt. Some Tiger crews resorted to draining fuel from wrecked vehicles, or even siphoning gasoline from civilian cars and motorcycles. Others were ordered to switch to smaller tanks like the Panther, which, though still fuel-hungry, could at least move more efficiently. But it was too late. The empire that once prided itself on speed and power was now crawling, or standing still. In the final months of the war, German strategy itself began to crumble under the weight of fuel shortages. Panzer commanders had to choose between mobility and survival. Every attack was limited by the simple question: how far can we go before the tanks stop? At the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble, fuel was everything. The plan depended on capturing Allied fuel depots to keep the offensive alive. When that failed, the offensive died with it. Tigers were abandoned in the Ardennes forests, their crews walking away in silence. Captain Holloway later summarized it perfectly in his after-action report. They built weapons too powerful for their own world. The Tiger's greatest weakness wasn't armor or firepower. It was its hunger. Fuel, the unseen lifeblood of war, had turned against Germany. The Tiger, once the terror of Europe, became a symbol of that fatal imbalance. Strength without sustainability, power without supply. As the Allies pushed into the heart of the Reich, they found dozens of Tigers left behind, empty, rusting, their engines cold. The monster hadn't been slain in battle. It had starved. And in that realization lay one of history's most ironic lessons. Sometimes, the mightiest machines fall not from defeat, but from the quiet exhaustion of the world that built them. When the Americans finally had a captured Tiger I under their control, they didn't just stare in awe, they wanted answers. Could it be destroyed? Could the unstoppable be stopped? The tests began at a proving ground outside Isigny, France, in late 1944. Engineers, ordnance officers, and curious soldiers gathered around the massive steel hulk. The Tiger loomed over everything, thick armor glinting in the pale winter light, its 88mm gun like the eye of a predator. For years, Allied crews had whispered about this tank. Some swore it was invincible. Others believed it could only be killed by luck. Now, at last, they would find out the truth. The Americans positioned several captured German guns, a few Shermans armed with the 76mm cannon, and even a British Firefly mounting the powerful 17-pounder. Cameras rolled. Range markers were set. The test began. The first round came from the Sherman's 75mm gun, a shell that bounced cleanly off the Tiger's frontal plate, leaving nothing but a small scorch mark. The observers nodded silently. That was expected. Then the 76mm fired. The shell hit with a hard metallic clang, and again it ricocheted away. Like hitting a brick wall, one tester muttered. When the British 17-pounder fired, the mood changed. The shot struck the side of the turret, penetrated, and blew out fragments of steel from the opposite wall. The crew cheered. "There it is," shouted one officer. "It can be killed." The results were carefully recorded. The Tiger's frontal armor, up to 100mm thick, was nearly impervious to most Allied guns at normal combat ranges. But its sides and rear, though still formidable, could be penetrated with the right weapon and the right angle. In practical terms, the Tiger wasn't invincible. It was simply unforgiving. American analysts concluded that hitting the Tiger from the front was nearly useless, but flanking it, ambushing it, or using concentrated fire could work. The key wasn't just power, but positioning. Meanwhile, field reports confirmed the same lessons. In Normandy, Allied tankers learned to call in artillery or fighter bombers when facing a Tiger head-on. Infantry with bazookas aimed for the tracks, immobilizing it before it could turn. Once the Tiger stopped moving, it became a target for everything else. One after-action report described a battle near Villers-Bocage. Our Shermans flanked left under smoke. The Tiger fired twice, missing both. When we got behind him, the 76 went through the rear plate. The whole thing went up. At the proving ground, further testing revealed even more weaknesses. The Tiger's thick plates were welded, not cast, and under repeated impacts, those welds began to crack. Its lower hull, designed for flat terrain, was vulnerable to mines and artillery shrapnel beneath the tracks. The mechanics also noted a flaw in the turret ring. A well-placed shot there could jam the entire rotation system, freezing the gun in place. Once immobilized, the mighty 88mm cannon was useless against targets it couldn't face. By early 1945, these findings were shared across Allied command. Training manuals were updated. Pilots were told to aim for the thin roof armor. Tank crews were instructed to maneuver for side shots. Bazooka teams were trained to disable the tracks first. The myth of invincibility was finally fading. But even then, the Tiger demanded respect. One American crewman described it best after the tests. "You don't fight a Tiger, you outsmart it." And that became the philosophy of Allied tank warfare for the rest of the war. Rather than trying to outgun the Tiger, the Allies learned to coordinate tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working as one. It wasn't about a single tank being better. It was about an army learning faster than its enemy. As the tests concluded, Captain Holloway walked around the battered Tiger. The armor was scarred and pitted, blackened from hundreds of impacts. He ran his hand across the gouges left by Allied shells. "This thing's a fortress," he said quietly. "But even fortresses fall when you know where to strike." The engineers nodded, marking down the data. They had found the limits of the beast. In the end, the Tiger could indeed be killed, not through brute force, but through knowledge. And that knowledge, shared among Allied tankers across Europe, would save countless lives in the months to come. When the final test shot echoed across the field, the Tiger's armor bore silent testimony to its legend, a machine both feared and flawed. As the smoke cleared, one officer turned to Holloway and asked, "What do we tell the boys on the front?" Holloway looked back at the tank, a steel monster humbled by its own design, and replied, "Tell them it's tough, but not immortal." The myth of invincibility died that day, replaced by something far more powerful: understanding. The Tiger had been wounded not by firepower, but by human ingenuity. And in that moment, the Allies proved that even the strongest armor can't protect against progress.